Okay, we're starting. Thank you for coming. Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to our adult summer reading grand finale. Thank you for coming. Thank you all for participating in the adult summer reading program. We began in June simply stating what most of us already know. Reading is the ultimate escape. And it went so quickly, it's hard to believe that we conclude today. We're glad that you've come to celebrate the finale, and we're also glad that our favorite author of the summer has accepted our party invitation. Later there will be a book signing, and we'll also have our grand prize drawings. If you look on the table here, we have our grand prizes. There's the picnic basket. This is really, we're getting a lot of feedback here, aren't we?
Just stand back.
I'll stand back some more. Is that better? Okay. We want it right for when Hillary speaks. Okay. And there's also sunglasses from Specs that were donated with the value of, I think, about $300.
Wow.
Okay. So those are the prize. Barrett's is here selling books. We'll have a book signing after, and books will be available for purchase, and we'll do the raffle after, too. There's also a bibliography. Erica, Janet, and Kim put in a good deal of time putting together a companion to Mudbound. If you like Mudbound, these are other books that you may like. There's also the announcement for our fall book discussion series, and I think that Hillary and Michael and Elizabeth will be glad to know that Mudbound is the first book for the fall series. So, this is the third year that we've offered a summer reading program for adults. And this has been our most successful year yet, with 495 people signing up. The author of our most successful and popular books is here this evening. Currently, there are 46 holds on our 15 copies of Mudbound. It is destined to become an American classic. That's my opinion. And I read it when it had this cover. Erica and I met Hillary in Philadelphia. Now we have this lovely, lovely cover for a wonderful, wonderful book. And it's our great pleasure today to have the author of Mudbound here today. Join me in welcoming Hillary Jordan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this warm welcome to Darien, my first time here. There's just nothing I like better than being in a room full of book-loving people, and I've had a great opportunity to do that on this book tour. I keep hearing, as we all do, that the novel is dead, no one's reading fiction. But I have to say I'm at the tail end of this very substantial book tour, and I've traveled all over the South. I've been to the Midwest, to many venues here in the Northeast, from independent bookstores to gatherings like tonight's. And I'm very pleased to report that rumors of the death of the novel are greatly exaggerated. Our country is chock full of people who love books and fiction. Personally, I can't imagine writing anything but fiction. When I was in graduate school, I actually tried to write nonfiction. I had a workshop that was a cultural criticism workshop, and I wrote a piece about pilgrimage in Natchez. Do you guys know what that is? The great houses in Natchez, all the old antebellum homes, open up twice a year, and you can sort of traipse through and see all the stuff. And I visited that when I was actually doing my research for Mudbound. And so anyway, I wrote this piece, cultural criticism, nonfiction, and I found myself dissatisfied with it. It just wasn't as compelling as I wanted it to be. So I went back and embellished a bit here, embroidered a bit there. I put in a thunderstorm at a key moment and added a conversation that hadn't actually taken place, though I told myself it could have taken place. And when I got the paperback, there was a note on it from the teacher, Liz Harris, who's a very respected journalist, saying, Did all this really happen? Because it just seems a little too perfect, if you know what I mean. So the second paper I wrote for that class, I thought, okay, I'm just going to remove the temptation of tinkering with actual events and do a movie review. Straightforward, you give a plot summary, you tell your opinion, piece of cake, right? So I picked a Jack Nicholson movie, which I'd actually hated, and I did the review. And I realized after I wrote it that it wasn't about the movie I'd seen. It was about the movie I saw in my head, the movie that they should have made. The beginning should have gone like this, the ending should have been more like that. You don't need that character, you don't need that scene. I had essentially reimagined the entire film. And Liz Harris very kindly said, you know, Hillary, you might want to stick to fiction. Mudbound, strangely enough, started out as nonfiction. I had an assignment in grad school, in a different class, to write 3 pages in the voice of a family member. And I decided to write about my grandparents' farm from my grandmother's point of view. The farm, which was called Mudbound, was this sort of near mythical place that I had grown up hearing about. My grandparents, my mother, and my aunt lived there for just 1 year after World War II. And out of that tumultuous year came all of these amazing stories. Some were funny, some were horrifying. Oftentimes they were both, as Southern stories tend to be. And I just love these stories. They were like a peephole into this sort of strange and marvelous world. And it was a very contradictory world, a world of terrible beauty. And they revealed things about my family, especially about my grandmother, who was the heroine of most of these stories for the simple reason that whenever calamity struck, my grandfather was invariably off somewhere else. My grandmother, Nana, was not a country girl. She was forced to become one in 1946 when my grandfather abruptly decided to move the family from the comforts of the city to a farm in Podunk, Arkansas. Like Henry in Mudbound, he wanted to be near his recently widowed sister. And 2, my grandfather revered the land and yearned to farm it. He was from Mississippi. He was land crazy. My grandmother had never seen the property, and I can only imagine how she felt when she discovered she would be living and rearing her 2 small children in an isolated, unpainted shotgun shack with no electricity, telephone, or running water. There was a river on the farm, and whenever it rained, the bridge would flood, and they would be stranded for days. It was my grandmother who coined the name Mudbound for the farm, and Windswept for the outhouse. But that was really the extent of her rebellion. Nana was a woman of her time, obedient to her husband's wishes, and so she made the best of things. My grandfather's brother came to live with them, followed by his cantankerous father, and she cooked and cleaned uncomplainingly for all of them. Like Laura in the novel, Nana was a singer, and the songs she sang were indicative of her mood. Rock of Ages was a frequent refrain on the farm, and when things got really bad, were you there when they crucified my Lord? To my mother and aunt, their year on the farm was a grand adventure, and indeed that's how all of their stories portrayed it. No one ever spoke about it in a way that was anything more than these warm memories. And it wasn't until I was in grad school and began to write these few pages that I realized what an ordeal that must have been for her. A woman living and raising her young children, 2 young girls, in such a place. And that in fact, these were stories of survival. The first words I wrote, which are still in the book, were, when I think of the farm, I think of mud. And tonight I thought I'd read that passage for you. Laura. When I think of the farm, I think of mud, liming my husband's fingernails and encrusting the children's knees and hair, sucking at my feet like a greedy newborn on the breast, marching in boot-shaped patches across the planked floors of the house. There was no defeating it. The mud coated everything. I dreamed in brown. When it rained, as it often did, The yard turned into a thick gumbo with a house floating in it like a soggy cracker. When the rains came hard, the river rose and swallowed the bridge that was the only way across. The world was on the other side of that bridge, the world of light bulbs and paved roads and shirts that stayed white. When the river rose, the world was lost to us and we to it. One day slid into the next. My hands did what was necessary, pumping, churning, scouring, scraping, and cooking, always cooking. Snapping beans in the necks of chickens, kneading dough, shucking corn, and digging the eyes out of potatoes. No sooner was breakfast over and the mess cleaned up than it was time to start on dinner. After dinner came supper, then breakfast again the next morning. Get up at first light, go to the outhouse, do your business, shivering in the winter, sweating in the summer, breathing through your mouth year-round. Steal the eggs from under the hens, haul in wood from the pile and light the stove, make the biscuits, slice the bacon and fry it up with the eggs and grits. Rouse your daughters from their bed, brush their teeth, guide arms into sleeves and feet into socks and boots. Take your youngest out to the porch and hold her up so she can clang the bell that will summon your husband from the fields and wake his hateful father in the lean-to next door. Feed them all and yourself. Scrub the iron skillet, the children's faces, the mud off the floors day after day while the old man sits and watches. He is always on you. You better stir them greens, gal. You better sweep that floor now. Better teach them brats some manners. Wash them clothes. Feed them chickens. Fetch me my cane. His voice clotted from smoking. His sly, pale eyes with their hard black sinners on you. He scared the children, especially my youngest, who was a little chubby. Come here, little piglet, he'd say to her. She peered at him from behind my legs, at his long yellow teeth, at his bony yellow fingers with their thick curved nails like pieces of ancient hoeing. Come here and sit on my lap. He had no interest in holding her or any other child. He just liked knowing she was afraid of him. When she wouldn't come, he told her she was too fat to sit on his lap anyway. She might break his bones. She started to cry, and I imagined that old man in his coffin. Pictured the lid closing on his face, the box being lowered into the hole, heard the dirt striking the wood. Pappy, I said, smiling sweetly at him, how about a nice cup of coffee? That's a bit of Laura. So I began with those few pages, well, something similar to them, and then I tried to turn it into a short story, which got longer and longer and longer. And at about the 50-page mark, I took a deep breath and admitted to myself that I was writing a novel. This was 8 years ago. I had started with reality, that the people I'd grown up hearing about and the things that actually happened to them. But the more I wrote, the more the characters insisted on being themselves, and the more trouble they got themselves into. Murder, lust, betrayal, forbidden love. With fiction, all of these things were possible, and oh, so beguiling to me as a writer. Laura's was the first voice I created, but as the story grew, I found myself wanting to hear other perspectives. Henry and Jamie came next, her husband and her brother. Then came the Jacksons, the African-American family who work as tenant farmers on the McCallans' land. And once they started speaking, the character of the story changed dramatically. What began as a family drama became a novel of social justice. This was the height of the Jim Crow era. And, again, I had grown up hearing a bit about this. My grandparents had black sharecroppers on their farm, as well as Mexican sharecroppers and white sharecroppers. And they had a black housekeeper. And these people were usually in the background of the stories, where African Americans in the Jim Crow South were thought to belong. My grandparents were both products of that time and place. Their racism was deeply ingrained, and yet they were good people, kind, big-hearted, devoutly Christian. That contradiction, the entrenched bigotry of otherwise good people, is a key underpinning of Mudbound. I decided to move the black characters to the foreground, to let them answer the ugliness of Jim Crow in their own voices. Frankly, I was a little nervous. A number of well-meaning colleagues said things to me like, "You know, even Faulkner didn't write about black people in the first person," referring, of course, to Dilsey in Sound and the Fury. But ultimately, I decided that letting my African-American characters speak was the only way to give them a small measure of justice. So I ended up with 6 voices, which is a big part of why it took me 7 years to write the book. But in the end, it was the only way I knew to tell the full story. And I believe that the strength of Mudbound and its truth come from being a chorus. This notion of voice, of who gets to speak and who is silenced, is at the core of the book, as those of you who have read it know. One of the greatest injustices you can deliver to anyone is to silence them or censor them. And in the Jim Crow South, blacks had no voice. And if they did voice their feelings, they were quickly suppressed. But they weren't the only ones. Women were also silenced to a certain extent by tradition and by societal expectations. And this is something Laura struggles with in Mudbound. She's a traditional housewife of her time. She can't speak to her husband about her true feelings about being uprooted and moved to this place, and she feels she has no voice in her fate. And also there's Jamie, a bomber pilot who comes home from the war very scarred, and he can't speak of it to anyone except Ronsel, the black son of the Jackson family, who is a fellow veteran and a member of the famed 761st Tank Battalion. So I'm going to read to you now the scene where Ronsel comes home to Mississippi after having fought valiantly in Europe. He arrives just as calamity has befallen his family. His father has broken his leg in an accident, and they've lost their mule, which means they've been forced into sharecropping, paying the McCallans 3/4 of their crop as opposed to half. This is Laura speaking. One Saturday at the end of April, the 5 of us went into town to do errands and have dinner at Dex's Diner, famed for its fried catfish and the sign outside that read, "Jesus loves you, Monday to Friday, 6 to 2, Saturdays, 6 to 8. After we ate, we stopped at Tricklebank's to get the week's provisions. Henry and Pappy lingered on the front porch with Orr Stokes and some other men, and the girls and I went inside to visit with the ladies. While I chatted with Rose, Amanda Lee and Isabel ran off to play with her 2 girls. We'd been talking for a few minutes when a Negro soldier came in the back door. He was a tall young man with skin the color of strong tea. There were sergeant stripes on his sleeves and a great many medals on his chest. He had a duffel bag slung over one broad shoulder. "Howdy, Miss Tricklebank," he said. "Been a long time." His voice was sonorous and full of music. It rang out loudly in the confines of the store, startling the ladies. "Is that you, Ronsel?" Rose said wonderingly. He grinned. "Yes, ma'am, last time I looked." So this was Florence's son. She told me all about him, of course, how smart he was, how handsome and brave, how he'd taken to book learning like a fish to water, how he drew people to him like bees to honey, and so on. "Ain't just me talking mama nonsense," she declared. "Ronsel's got a shine to him. You'll see it the minute you lay eyes on him. The gals all want to be with him, and the men all want to be like him. They can't help it. They're drawn to that shine." I had thought it was mama nonsense, though I hadn't said so. What mother doesn't believe her firstborn son has more than his fair share of God's gifts? But when I saw Ronsel standing there in Tricklebanks, I understood exactly what she meant. He dipped his head politely to me and the other ladies. "Afternoon," he said. "Well, I declare," said Rose, "aren't you grown up? How you been doing, Miss Tricklebank?" "Getting along fine. You seen your folks yet?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Bus just got in. I stopped to buy a few things for him." I studied him as Rose helped him with his purchases. He looked more like Hap, but he had Florence's way of filling up a room and then some. You couldn't help but watch him. He had that kind of force. He glanced over at me curiously, and I realized he'd caught me staring. "I'm Mrs. McCallan," I said, a little embarrassed. "Your parents work on our farm." "How do," he said. His eyes only met mine briefly, but in those few seconds I had the feeling I'd been thoroughly assessed. "Do Hap and Florence know you're coming home?" I said. "No, ma'am. I wanted to surprise them." "Well, I know they'll be mighty glad to see you." His forehead wrinkled in concern. "Are they all right?" He didn't miss much, this son of Florence's. I hesitated, then told him about Hap's accident, emphasizing the positive. "He's using crutches now, and the doctor said he should be walking again by June." "Thank God for that," Ronsel said. "He can't stand to be idle. He's probably driving Mama crazy being underfoot all day." Uneasily, I looked away from him. "What is it?" he asked. I realized suddenly that the other women had gone dead silent and were watching us, making no effort at discretion. Some looked shocked, others hostile. Rose looked concerned, and her eyes held a warning. I turned back to Ronsel. "Your parents lost their mule," I said, "and then we had a spell of bad weather. They're using our stock now, and your mother's working in the fields with your brothers." His jaw tightened and his eyes turned cold. "Thank you for telling me," he said. The ironic emphasis on the first two words was impossible to miss. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Alice Stokes. "Excuse me," I said to Ronsel, "I have shopping to do." As I walked away from him, I heard him say, "I'll come back for that cloth later, Miss Tricklebank. I better get on home now." He paid Rose hurriedly and headed for the front door with his purchases in his duffel bag. Just before he reached the door, it opened and Pappy came in, followed by Orris Stokes and Doc Turpin. Ronsel stopped just short of running into him. "Beg pardon," he said. He tried to step around him, but Orris moved to stand in his way. "Well, looky here, a jig in uniform." Ronsel's body went very still, and his eyes locked with Orris's. But then he dropped his gaze and said, "Sorry, sir, I wasn't paying attention." "Where do you think you're going, boy?" said Doc Turpin. "Just trying to get home to see my folks." The door opened again, and Henry and a few other men came inside, crowding behind Pappy, Orris, and Doc Turpin. All of them wore unfriendly expressions. I felt a flicker of fear. "Honey," I called out to Henry, "this is Hap and Florence's son Ronsel, just returned from overseas." "Well, that explains it then," drawled Pappy. "Explains what?" said Ronsel. "Why you're trying to leave by the front door. You must be confused as to your whereabouts." "I ain't confused, sir." "Oh, I think you are, boy," Pappy said. "I don't know what they let you do over there, but you're in Mississippi now. Niggers don't use the front here." "Why don't you go on out the back where you belong?" said Orris. "I think you'd better," said Henry. "Go on now." It got very quiet. The air fairly crackled with hostility. I saw muscles tense and hands clench into fists. But if Ronsel was afraid, he didn't show it. He looked slowly around the store, meeting the eyes of every man and woman there, mine included. "Just go," I pleaded with him silently. He let the moment drag out, waiting until just before the breaking point to speak. "You know, sir, you're right," he said to Pappy. "We didn't go in the back over there. They put us right out in the front, right there on the front lines, face to face with the enemy. And that's where we stayed the whole time we were there. The Jerrys killed some of us, but in the end, we kicked the hell out of them. Yes, sir, we sure did." With a nod to Rose, he turned and strode out the back door. "Did you hear what he just said?" sputtered Pappy. "Nigger like that ain't gonna last long around here," said Orris. "Maybe we ought to teach him better manners," said Doc Turpin. Things might have turned ugly, but Henry stepped forward and faced them, hands up and palms out. "No need for that. I'll have a word with his father." For a moment I was afraid they wouldn't back down, but then Orris said, "See that you do, McCallan." The men dispersed, and the tension lifted. I did my shopping and rounded up the girls, and we left Tricklebanks. On the way back to Mudbound, we came upon Ronsel walking down the middle of the road. He moved to one side to let us pass. As we went by him, I traded another glance with him through the open window of the car. His eyes were defiant, and they were shining. My grandparents are long dead, as are the sharecroppers who worked for them. I often wonder what they all would have thought of the story that I made from their stories. Certainly Nana would have been horrified by the idea of committing adultery with her brother-in-law. Pappy, who by all accounts was a bigoted SOB, would not have appreciated being killed off for it, which he is in the first chapter, so I'm not giving anything away. And my black characters would undoubtedly have wanted to set me straight about a few things. But my hope is that all of them would be proud that I was so captivated by their stories I had to retell them, and pleased that I've painted a lasting, if fictional, picture of their world. Thank you. And now I'm very happy to take questions, and I hope you'll ask me some, because this is my favorite part. Yes?
Why did you choose not to have Pappy be one of the voices?
Well, now, see, that's a very interesting question, because I actually did have Pappy as a voice for a while. And let's just say that everyone hated it. My editor hated it, Barbara Kingsolver hated it. It was just, I think that, and I couldn't see it at the time. Now I'm so glad that I didn't have him as a voice, because, you know, he's the villain. And I just kind of liked the idea that I unvoiced him, which is what I did. But I did start out by having him narrate his own funeral, and then I gave those scenes to Jamie, which I think was a much better choice.
Of all your characters, he was probably almost totally unsympathetic.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say he's a three-dimensional character in the sense that the others are. And so in that sense, too, it's good that he doesn't have his own voice, because then I would have had to give him something, and I really didn't want to. Yes?
What is your relationship with Barbara Kingsolver? Is she a mentor, or you just admire her? Or?
She is a bit of a mentor. Barbara actually gave me the Bellwether Prize. That is her prize, which she founded with part of her advance money from Poisonwood Bible. And once I won the prize, Barbara gave me comments on the manuscript, and she read, I think, 3 or 4 drafts of Mudbound, and has been, just through this whole process, has been incredibly supportive, been a real cheerleader for Mudbound. And
so you won the prize before the novel was published?
I sent in to the prize the second draft of the book. This is the 11th draft of the book. So I won the prize based on that very early draft, and then did a number of revisions, a couple with Barbara, then some more with Algonquin once they became my publisher, and also a revision or 2 with my editor, my agent. So, you know, it's a long and winding road, but...
Can you explain the premise of the prize, please?
Okay. So the Bellwether Prize, for those of you who don't know, is... if you're familiar with Barbara's writing, you know, she's very politically, her books have a message, and she wanted to found this prize to reward novels that address issues of social justice, novels that, as she puts it on the website, imagine humane possibilities. And so, you know, when I was broke and trying to, you know, having written the second draft of the book, didn't have an agent, didn't have a publisher, I read about this thing, and I thought, you know, Mudbound kind of does that. And so I just sent it in with a check for $30, thinking there goes $30, right? And then in the intervening time, I did get an agent, and then I found out I was a semifinalist, and I thought, oh, well, at least I made the semifinals. And then I found out a few months later that I was a finalist, and I'm like, wow, okay, that's a really good sign for the book. Totally didn't expect to win. And then by that point, my agent was ready to send this book out to publishers, but we couldn't, because part of the Bellwether Prize was supposed to be publication by a different publisher. And so we were waiting, and then I got this phone call one day on my cell phone, and this woman says, "Is this Hillary Jordan?" And I immediately thought, telemarketer, and I said yes, and she said, and maybe she didn't hear me or something. She said, "This is Hillary Jordan," and then I just went, "Yes," totally rude. And she said, "This is Barbara Kingsolver, and I'm calling to tell you that you've won the Bellwether Prize." Which was a very nice, it was $25,000, so as you can imagine, to a starving writer, that was quite helpful. And the relationship with this other publisher did not work out because they wanted me to eliminate 6 of the voices and rewrite the whole book from Laura's perspective, which I declined to do. And so my agent sent the book out, and Algonquin embraced it and loved it from day one, and that's why I'm standing here today. Wow. So, yes, ma'am.
I thought you said that your grandparents, they lived on that farm only 1 year?
Yes.
So did all these things really happen?
No. This is fiction.
Is a novel.
It's definitely a novel. The sort of construct of the book, a woman who marries older, thinks she's a spinster, marries an older man, they have 2 daughters, they move to this farm. So I started with these sort of, the construct of the way the book is constructed. But the characters themselves, as I said, quickly became fictional, took on their own lives, took on their own personalities. And certainly the events, nobody was murdered in my family, for example. So certainly the events are fictional, yes. Yes?
Beyond your family stories, what was your research process like for writing?
I did a lot of research, and in fact I know more than should be legally allowable about things like boll weevils and tractors and fertilizer. But I have done, the most helpful things to me by far were first-person accounts of people who lived during that era. I found a wonderful account by an Alabama sharecropper, accounts by bomber pilots, accounts by some of the men who served in the Negro Army, who served in the 761st Tank Battalion. If you want to try and create an excellent portrait of a Southern racist of that era, Lanterns on the Levee is a really good book to read. So by William Alexander Percy, who is very famous in Mississippi. So I just read everything I could get my hands on from people who had lived then. Because, this book is told 100% in the first person, and I wanted to ground it in people's real experiences. Yes?
Will you continue to write more about Mississippi?
No. I've left Mississippi, at least for the time being. I was really ready to get out of Mississippi, and I was ready to get out of the first person, and I was ready to get out of the past. So my next book is actually set about 30 years in the future. It's told in the third person, and it's set in a sort of dystopian right-wing America, and that's really all I can say about it.
Look forward to reading.
Thank you very much. Me too. Yes.
This is only a comment, but I think you're a very gifted writer, but you could have been an actress too.
No, I could not have. Trust me on that. Definitely.
I thought of it, but you're really good.
Well, thank you very much. I obviously I have a lot of feeling for this book. If you stuck me in front of, I don't know, The Great Gatsby, I probably wouldn't be as good as this. Yes. Yes.
Will you be reading the book so that it will be a book on tape?
I have not been invited to do so, and in fact the book is a book on tape, and what to say about that? It's very interesting. They did hire 6 actors to do it. None of them are Southerners, so it's a bit, to me, a bit odd. One of them is a Texan, though, and he sounds like he should be reading Lonesome Dove. But there is a book on tape for people who like books on tape. It does exist already, and I'm sure they probably have it at this library. I'm guessing.
I went to Barnes & Noble today because I wanted to buy another copy and also give it to a friend of mine who has very bad eyesight. And
There's a large print edition,
Okay.
and there's a book on tape. I think the books on tape are only available at libraries, and you don't... Oh, Bookstore has it? I mean, I was told they were charging like $110 for it, so how is that possible that they're selling any? Okay. Well, maybe I got I obviously...
There may be two versions.
Yeah, there may be.
You know, the
Yeah, I obviously had wrong information. Anyway, both of those options exist. If you go to my website, HillaryJordan.com, it'll show you where the large print edition and where you can order it. And I've not yet put the book on tape up on my website, but I probably should do that. So, yes.
What experience or research did you do on alcoholism? I thought your portrayal of Jamie was quite realistic. It reminded me a little bit of Charming Billy, Alice McDermott's
Right.
depiction of the alcoholic.
I have a family member who suffers from that disease, so I think I had quite a bit of empathy for it and understanding of it. Yes.
I was just curious, in your author speaking engagements, have you spoken in front of blacks that may have grown up in the Mississippi Delta in that time frame, and what their reaction was to the book? I would think it would bring back a lot of painful memories.
I've actually had very few African Americans come to my readings. Some when I was in Mississippi. But I have not, spoken to a largely black audience at any point on the tour. I've gotten letters from African Americans, people who have written to say that they like the book, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. But I haven't heard from the black community in any kind of organized way. I haven't been even reviewed in the black press. But
I know I have a friend that is, she was born in 1948, so she would have been at the end of, right when your stories ended. But she, has talked to me about, she's one of 16.
well, Jim Crow didn't end until
No.
the late '60s.
Yeah,
It
she
was
didn't
still.
until 1965. And
Yeah.
So she's just, a little older than I am, and the stories she tells, and I'm thinking of giving her the book, but because it's her 60th birthday, but I'm not sure if I'm going to, cause a sadness in her, knowing,
Well, I'm.
But I think on the other hand, it would be, it would be the voice that you give.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a biracial family. My mother's partner of 30 years is black, and none of Michael's family or Michael saw the book until after it was published, and I was very, sort of eager to know what they thought, and I, especially his mother, who's of that era as well, and Mildred said that it gave voice to some things that she thought needed to be voiced. And that was a very good feeling for me to hear that from her. But obviously she's just one person, so I don't know. I don't know what to tell you to do about your friend. Maybe you should ask her. Just tell her this brings up some painful stuff. Do you want to read it or not?
I think all of us, I'm speaking to the questioner, because I think all of us who love reading novels that bring up truths, and sometimes painful truths or painful episodes, maybe that speak to things that we have experienced ourselves, there is a satisfaction that comes from having this articulated, and I think a reassurance that we are not the only ones who have experienced something, one thing or another, or who, I would say, who are alone with some of the thoughts and feelings that we've had. And nobody can tell you what to do about giving it to your friend or not, but I think, on the contrary, it would be a gift.
This is my publisher, so she really just wants you to buy a copy of that book.
I do love the book, however. I'm speaking as a reader more than as a publisher. But yes, all of you should buy the book.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, since you mentioned that you're from a biracial family, do you think it kind of helps people to recall the past, or should they forget the past, or how should people handle it?
I think everyone is different in the way they handle things. I myself don't get over stuff unless I acknowledge it and think about it and talk about it, and but everyone is very different. I feel like race is our country's great shame, and it's a topic that is incredibly difficult for Americans to talk about. And obviously this conversation about race is getting a nice kickstart right now because of Obama. But I think it's, obviously we've come a long way since the days of Jim Crow, but I think we still have a ways to go. And that talking about it and discussing what happened, because, the effects of Jim Crow we're still feeling today. And so I think that's healthy. I don't know about for individuals, but I think as a country, it's something we really have got to grapple with.
The dialogue.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Did all your drafts end with Ronzo's entry?
Nope. Did all my drafts end with Ronsel's entry. I had a different ending, which I was never happy with, and I just knew it wasn't the right ending. And actually, the ending is the only part of the book that I wrote longhand. And I was actually sitting in front of my fire one night, and I had just been going, oh God, how am I going to end this book? How am I going to end this book? And it just came to me, and I just wrote it out longhand in about an hour. And it's not word for word, but it's pretty darn close to what I thought of that night. And when I wrote it, all the hairs on my arms stood up, and I said, this is the ending of the book. So, anyone else? Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful night.